Hello and welcome to the History Respawn podcast. I'm your host, Bob Whitaker. On today's episode, I'll be talking with Dr. Tyler Kynn, who's an assistant professor of history at Central Connecticut State University. Dr. Kynn is the co-creator of a twine-based history game called the Hajj Trail, which takes the model of the Oregon Trail and adapts it for the 17th century Islamic world. The Hajj Trail touches on a number of topics near and dear to History Respawn, including historians developing games, history games with a non-Western focus, and using twine in the classroom. If you'd like to check out the Hajj Trail for yourself, go and visit hajtrail.com to check out the game. I hope you enjoy the episode. Tyler, welcome to History Respawn.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So Tyler, before we get to talking about the Hajj Trail, I'm curious about your own history with digital games. Have games always been a part of your life?
Yeah, it's something that has always been there in the background. Through when I was a kid, I would play. We had the old Windows Encarta on our computer, and so there was like the free, or I guess they're free games that came with that I played as a kid that were like there's some one where you like did some mixing animals together. I don't know, some bizarre sort of free games that came with Windows Encarta, and then as a kid play like other educational games which became, we can talk about later about Trail. I grew up playing just like because that's what our computer ran in my family's household. The Amazon Trail and Yukon Trail, which were like
Yes.
the less prominent expansions or sequels to the Oregon Trail. And then, middle school playing Battlefield 1942. Later on in college, would play like Assassin's Creed. The main one I had played through was the first Assassin's Creed 1, and then I did like played all three of the Ezio trilogy. As someone that studies Ottoman history and the Ottoman Empire, it was exciting to see the third one.
Revelations. Yeah.
Yeah, Revelations. It came right as I was getting into, I would say. Revelations came right as I was getting into studying Ottoman history, and very quickly, I think very shortly after that, I had gone to Istanbul as an undergrad and study abroad, and it was sort of seeing the way in which the game presents Istanbul and how Istanbul actually looks. They put in the more palm trees everywhere when there's not really palm trees in Istanbul's much more of a Balkan city, but they made it much more, the Orientalist view of a Middle Eastern city. So, it's kind of, that was the first disconnect, is how sort of seeing sort of the way in which how games present an imagined space versus the real space. Yeah, and then I played Rise of Nations a bunch growing up. When I was in my master's program, I studied 2 years in Hungary at Central European University, and I had this tiny, tiny laptop that couldn't run anything, as I'm sure many folks have been in such situation. So I would play what was then called Warlight. I think it's called Warzone now. It's basically just like a free Risk game you can play online, and we'd play with all our friends together, and then played a little bit of the Total War series, particularly medieval Total War. And so then it's sort of like, as it's always been there in the background, and it sort of was just sort of a hobby and interest that became sort of more of a concrete thing at the very tail end of my PhD program, when I was like, hey, I really like playing games and thinking about historical worlds. I'm writing this dissertation. Why don't I just try to combine the two?
Yeah.
And it's sort of how this entire project that you have me on here today sort of came about, was sort of combining those two aspects together. That has always been part of my life, but on two different tracks.
Yeah, that's great. I can share a similar story with History Respawn, which I started in my last year of my PhD. And so, it's people making excellent choices. First, going to history graduate school to begin with, and then secondly, deciding, oh, I'm just going to take on this huge other project at the very end of my dissertation because I've just got
Yeah, it
so
is.
much time.
It's the perfect time to start new projects. And as I always joke, I spent more time on coding the Hajj Trail than I think I functionally spent writing the dissertation, which I don't know is a positive sign from my advisor. But
Yeah, maybe don't put that on the CV. That would be
yeah,
my
yeah,
recommendation.
it's not front and center. Yeah.
So I can kind of guess, given your past history with games, what inspired you to make the Hajj Trail. But I'm just kind of wondering, in particular, what drew you to this project, and were there any particular games that served as either a good inspiration or maybe a bad one?
Yeah. So I started this project in 2020 with my sort of co-creator Russ Gastia, who had a little bit of background in coding. He like studied something completely different, early modern Germany. But we were just talking one day. As we are sort of writing the dissertations in the sort of last years of our program, and I was going through all these stories that I'm getting from my own research, which is on pilgrimage narratives to Mecca in the 17th century. And we're talking about all the sort of pitfalls that happen to these travelers traveling the desert, the difficulties of the travel. And I'm just giving anecdotes from the things I've read. And, we sort of made a joke that, oh, it sounds like the Oregon Trail. And that sort of led very quickly to us talking where Russ suggested, he was like, well, would it be so hard to make a Hodge version of the Oregon Trail? Because there's this thing called twine. And that was sort of the infamous words that started this, because it did take a very, very long time to make it. But in our minds, it was a very simple task. And Russ helped with the sort of early build up of the code for the mechanics in the background of it. And then he went and had a kid, and he sort of went off and did his own thing. And then I continued with the project to build it out and build up the content for the following years as we were putting it together. But it was sort of, once again, directly sort of connected to sort of seeing the old Oregon Trail, how relatively of a simple concept it was to put together, in terms of just text based primarily, with images, twine as a very user friendly tool in which to do that, and being like, hey, this is still useful, it's still
Hmm.
valuable. Yeah, a game doesn't have to have amazing graphics and a multi-million-dollar budget to be a useful tool in the classroom.
Hmm.
Um, this is also the same time that, not that we made Among Us, but it's the same time that Among Us was popping off, that we put it together. And the success of sort of non, you know, dramatically complicated games, I think, also was like, hey, this is something we can do, and it's not something to be ashamed of, that we can put something together on our own for free that is going to be, once again, directly inspired by an older concept, but hadn't really been done for most other parts of the world. The Oregon Trail and their successors, the Amazon Trail, the Yukon Trail, and then they went bankrupt, was sort of, it was very uh, Western focused. Even the Amazon Trail was very about like meeting Henry Ford and his rubber plantations in the Amazon jungle in the 19th century, early 20th century. And so one of the things that I had sort of come across in my last years of PhD, I was also teaching. And there's so many great digital tools and games that depict Europe, that depict the Americas in some way. And the Middle East and the Ottoman world was very limited.
Yeah.
Um, the imagination of the Ottoman past limited to just a few games. If it isn't games, it's just the Ottomans have cannons. That's their tech. That's what they do. Islam sort of connected to just violence and religion, sort of a more sort of conservative vision of sort of religion and Islamic societies. And there wasn't really this aspect in which any game tried to tell the story of the social history of the Ottoman world, which is very rich, very, I think, unique in the broader history of the world and places. And that's what we felt like, we could make something that was different,
Hmm.
that was a very simple concept in terms of a game, but would provide a very different imagination of the past than other things that are out there.
Yeah.
And that was sort of what sort of drove the hundreds of hours of research and coding in my spare times as I was teaching, in my finishing my PhD, then starting my first job at the University of Memphis, you know, as an instructor. Those were, I was teaching full time and also then in the evenings just adding stops, researching places um, for the Hajj Trail to really build it out. And it was because I felt it would be a useful tool to one, basically take what I'd done in my dissertation, but use a vehicle which I thought was more useful to tell the story of that the written word, writing a book, writing a dissertation can tell history one way, but there's a way in which choice based, like just a text based game like the Hajj Trail, can tell the story of travel and pilgrimage when in a much more engaging way, in a way in which I always talk about how it's connected to this notion of time, that
Hmm.
I can give a student a pilgrimage account or a travel narrative, and I can tell them to read it for a class, and we'll talk about what the pilgrim experienced in his travels across the desert. And that, will take a few minutes to read, maybe a whole, a part of the journey that would have taken the pilgrim a whole month in their brief itinerary will only take 5 seconds to glance over on a page, 10 seconds. It's just 1 or 2 pages long, stop by stop by stop by stop. And that's very limiting how you actually connect to that person.
Yeah.
If I put you even into a game, you can play with an element of time, the element of time, in a much more intentional way than you can with a book or with sort of simple like reading an assignment or a primary source. That if a student comes across those same experiences that are talked about in the primary source, but they've already invested 2 to 3 hours of going through the Hajj Trail, they finally get to the desert and then they encounter the same challenges that pilgrims face, you can give that sunk cost, that student, that player has invested time to get to this place far away, and they're suddenly out of supplies, they're out of water, they face these challenges, and if they make the wrong choice, all that time will seemingly be for nothing. And that experience is obviously nowhere near traveling 3 to 4 to 5 months in the 17th century across the world, but it gives much more of a glimpse of that emotion, that stress, that anxiety in a much more, I think, relatable way than a simple text can provide.
Right.
That use of time, that sitting down and playing a game, making those choices, and you feeling that your choices have consequences, is something that I think is why games should be more, one, dramatically used in education and thought about as valuable tools to tell stories of the past as a medium, which is much better than the other mediums his traditional historians use.
Hmm.
So that's, how this all came about and how it sort of went together bit by bit along the way.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's great too. I think, you make a good point about the lack of coverage of the Middle East and the Muslim world by games generally, but there's also a lack of coverage in terms of everyday people in the past.
Yeah.
And so this is one of the things I really like about this game is not only does it explore the Middle East, the history of the Middle East and the Ottoman world, but it also does so at the level of everyday people. So, the player characters that you have in this game, in one instance, you do have a princess, but for most of the other characters, they're not related to royalty. They themselves are not necessarily leaders in society. They are not all powerful assassins, manipulating world history at the end of a hidden blade. And so I think, another commendable thing about this game is it's kind of focused on everyday lives, everyday people going through extraordinary events rather than, kind of a godlike player character that is totally powerful and all knowing, which is usually what you see in video games.
Yeah, no, I can imagine it would be a very different, it would just be completely disconnected experience to be the sort of all powerful character going through the Hajj Trail, because you wouldn't face any challenges.
Yeah.
Everything is conquerable. Everything is, and that's not, Yeah, and that's not the experience that these pilgrims faced in the primary sources that we based it on, these travel accounts. And also that's not the experience for most pilgrims. Even the Ottoman princess, which is that player character is chosen as sort of the easiest difficulty, but also to give a nod to the fact that no Ottoman sultan, no Ottoman prince, except for one, ever went on the pilgrimage to Mecca. They would pay someone to do it for them because it takes a lot of time. And if you're in power struggles in the capital, you don't want to be vacant for a year. So it was something that the women of the Ottoman dynasty would represent the empire on the Hajj. And even with that high privileged position of being a royal member of the Ottoman household, representing the dynasty on the Hajj, far away in Mecca on the journey, even in 1757, there's a famous Bedouin nomadic raid on the Hajj caravan in which an Ottoman princess will die along with 10,000 pilgrims in the desert.
Yeah.
Because all their water and food is taken from them, and she becomes the only Ottoman princess ever to die in combat. And this is, the way in which, even though she has the power of the state behind her, there's still vulnerability historically for those people in this very dangerous journey that you pass through these cities and these places. But in between, as anyone passes 17th century, if you're not in a city and there's no soldiers guarding said city, it's a very dangerous place in the rural countryside. And that's comes up in the travel narratives and pilgrimage accounts that we base the game on, but that's then built into the events that I always say that the player playing through this is playing everything that happens to the player is something that happened to an actual pilgrim. So every event is based on historical grounding of something that happened to someone, but you playing it are basically becoming the most unlucky pilgrim in all of world history, because it is happening to you almost all at once. Because we want to show to the player the things that would happen to pilgrims, the challenges they would face along the way in traveling the 17th century Ottoman world. But it's like, Evliya Çelebi, a traveler that we use lots of his travel accounts in this 17th century Ottoman pilgrim and traveler. He's sometimes called the Marco Polo of Turkey, right? It's a 10-volume travel account across the Ottoman world. And he, on his journey to Mecca, I think they get robbed twice along the way. But if you're playing through the Hajj Trail, you could get robbed a bunch more times.
Yes.
Once again,
that was definitely my experience.
There's a way, there's a way in which you are experiencing things that happen to pilgrims, but you are just experiencing them at a much more, the much more unlucky clip than anyone else.
So this game, as you were referencing there, it includes a lot of primary sources, and usually these are found in the historical account tab on the play screen. And I'm just wondering if you could give us a little bit more detail about how you went about choosing these sources and how you went about deciding on where to place them in the game.
Yeah, so we had basically, as sort of we're building out the sort of more than 300 different locations that are represented in the game. Everything that we're sort of putting in each location is, I wanted to base it on how a pilgrim or a traveler experienced that place as close to the time in which you're supposed to be traveling, which is around 1670, 1671 is the time period of the game. And so I wanted it to be that if you're a student or a player and you're just curious and you're going through, you can get at least some hint about how someone in the past also described or imagined the same landscape or the same place that you're going through. And sometimes there's hints at through those historical quotes if there's good or bad water at this place, things like that, because everything mentioned in those accounts will then be I'll try to embed it into how each place, the variables that are put into each location that you experience. But it required a lot of research, because obviously for my dissertation, for my current book project, the things that I look at as an historian traditionally when I was going through pilgrimage narratives and travel accounts was mainly the big places. You look at a travel account as a historian, and you're like, okay, what did they say about Aleppo, Damascus, Mecca, Medina, Istanbul? You're excited to see what they say about the big known places. And you sort of skip through these minor little towns or villages in between as you're skimming through the text, because usually travelers in the past don't talk a lot. They maybe a sentence or two about those small places in between. And two, you're going to have most places for comparison between sources in those big sort of centers of trade, like Damascus, like Jerusalem, and elsewhere. And so for researching for this game, I had to include descriptions of all the places in between. There's a way in which I had to go back to all the sources and look at them in a different light than I had done for my dissertation and for my own research, in a whole new light, that I needed to care about those places in between. That became to reshape my own thinking about the pilgrimage to Mecca, the journey, the travel, that what you think about is going to these big places, but where the pilgrims spent most of the time is these small caravanserais and 10 hours from anywhere in the middle of the Anatolian countryside or in the Arabian desert. And it's these small places in between that pilgrims actually spent most of their time on the journey. These places that aren't written about in grand histories of the Ottoman world because they're not the big places. And so it was about finding travel accounts, finding descriptions of these places, which sometimes I had to jump. There was like a priority list. If I could find one of the pilgrimage accounts from the 17th century describing it, I would include that quote.
Mm.
There's nothing there talked about this place. I would then go to 16th or 18th century sources, see what I could find. Can't find anything there. I'd then look up European travel accounts when they go to the Ottoman world, if they describe this place. If that's a no, then I jump to 19th century, see if they describe the place. If there's nothing in the 19th century, then I include a vague description of what the place looks like today. So that was sort of the priority list of what I want to put in the historical account section, which is really just one, showing my work. It's showing what each site, the things that you encounter there, the goods, the items, the water quality and the location, what that's based on, to give the choice for the player to dive more deeply into that place that their player character is in. And it sort of became this, catalog of all the things I was reading and looking through to try to recreate these, particularly these Ottoman rural spaces, which are often not discussed even in the primary sources. The Ottomans, as I learned when I was trying to source artwork for this project, the Ottomans rarely depicted rural landscapes. It's one of the things that speaks a lot to the Ottoman world as a very urban focused, Islam being tied to particularly urban spaces as well. But the Ottomans as well, particularly, really like to describe and depict the major cities of the empire. So it was very difficult to try to come up with, okay, well, what about, once again, these places in between?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where the historical account, it's sort of chronicling that work. Originally, it was just a giant wall of text. And so to cut down on the difficulties of walls of text, we just made it a tab as an option to be like, if you see this image, you're in this place, and you're like, hey, maybe I'll take a deeper look. You can get a quote about that place, about how someone else experienced. But if not, you can just click on through the experience. And that's sort of we wanted to have them there, but not as a mandatory thing that you're overwhelmed by too much text on the page, which is a constant struggle for myself and using Twine. So
yeah. So I really love the random events in this game, and you've got a great collection here of sandstorms, merchant disputes, imposter pilgrim guides, Bedouin raids. I've been through many, many Bedouin raids at this point. And I'm wondering, could you talk a little bit about how these events work? How did you decide on what events to include? And then, maybe give us a sense, behind the curtain of how these pop up for the player.
Yeah, so for how they're included, it's basically as going through travel accounts, the primary sources. I'd say we have, I think it's about 10 to 12 early modern travel accounts that we utilize, and then other travel narratives beyond that.
Mm-hmm.
But 10 to 12 pilgrimage accounts directly that are used or referenced. And basically, if a pilgrim mentions something that happened to them, Bedouin raids are a major thing that happens in the desert. We built in a system that basically, if you pay the tribute to the Bedouin, which is what the Ottoman state was supposed to do, the Bedouin tribes are supposed to be given a payoff every year by the Ottoman governor of Damascus to not attack the caravan and provide camels and horses for the caravan. And oftentimes was the case, the governor would embezzle said money, and the Bedouin would not get enough, and they would strike back. They would attack the caravan, rob it, or sometimes poison wells by putting dead animals in the water wells in the middle of the desert, so that when the caravan comes, there's no water for the pilgrims. So this is sort of this back and forth of struggle. that we built in a way that you can, so some of the events are tied to sort of illuminate some of these dynamics that shaped the journey. So one based on pilgrimage accounts, but also other literature on the history of the Hajj, the history of the Ottoman world, which, trying to highlight the rise in banditry in the 17th century, the stipend system for paying the Bedouins for crossing the desert. There's other events which are in reference to different broader books in the social history of the Ottoman world. So there's like a court event that you encounter, which court records are the center for social history of the Ottoman past. So several of the stories from that are taken from prominent historians like Leslie Pierce, who write about court records and the dynamics of using the courts and stuff in the Ottoman world. And so the events are meant to sort of be that constant reminder to the player, the different dynamics that shape the world around them. Mm-hmm. Some of it is directly related to the history of the Hajj, and some of it is related just to dynamics within the social history of the 17th century Ottoman world. Mm-hmm. And so these are all sourced from the either both secondary or primary sources. There's some specific events, like in the Balkans, there's like a Bulgarian witch, which is like a story of Evliya Çelebi, the Ottoman traveler, where there's this fantastical story he tells about a supposed witch he encounters. So we include those, and there are different stories that are told at the time. So the player is encountering, once again, that rich cultural world that was the 17th century Balkans and Middle East. Mm-hmm. How the player encounters them is, so on the back end, we have a RNG random number generator that spits you out a number between 1 and 100. Each region, so Anatolia, Arabia, Palestine, Rumelia, which is Ottoman Balkans, the sea route as well, and Syria, all have a different set of events. Some of them are the same, some of them are unique to that region, and some of them are unique to specific areas. So there's like a mountain, not a mountain lion, a panther event, essentially. As there used to be these snow leopards, I guess snow leopard officially. There used to be these snow leopards in Anatolia. They're now extinct, but they were prominent in the 17th century. Evliya Çelebi wrote a story about a snow leopard. And so therefore I was like, okay, we have to have a snow leopard event. And so we made one, but it only occurs in the mountains. So there's also set checks within a region for certain geographies in which some events will only occur. And there's some specific city events for Istanbul, and then specific city events for Medina and particularly Mecca as well. And so we have sort of this subset that you do get different events based on where you are. There are some universal events that will happen anywhere, like the court cases. There's different types of bandits in different places that you encounter, with them different variabilities and difficulties related to them. But essentially, as you go between one stop to another stop, you get a number. That number then takes into account the speed that you're traveling. So we have a slow, medium, and fast speed. The faster you go, the more risk you take. The dynamic of the game is that you're supposed to try to make it in Mecca in time for the Hajj season. There's only 1 month of year in which you can do the Hajj. And so therefore it was incumbent on pilgrims in the past to time their journey correctly. If not, you have to wait in the holy cities for a whole year for the next Hajj. And so that dynamic of slow, medium, fast speed, the faster you go, the more risk you're taking, because presumably you're traveling ahead of the formal caravan, and therefore you get more difficult events. If you're going slower, the slowest speed, you get slightly more easier events. So it puts you into a whole different list of events that can happen to you. And if you go to more shrines along the way, which represent the sacred geography that many pilgrims talk about, that they're not just going on the pilgrimage to Mecca and Medina and Jerusalem, they're also going for all these local Sufi shrines that are dotted across the Ottoman world. And by going to those, you increase what we call the pilgrim path meter. That essentially increases your luck. So the more you go to shrines, basically the more you're enacting what an actual pilgrim would have valued in their travel, because we didn't want to give you like money or goods for going to those places. So the benefit for the player, the incentive for the player, is that technically it does increase your luck. So that means you can, if you go to enough of the shrines, you can travel at the fastest speed, but get the easiest randomizer of
Ah.
events.
Okay,
That's
so there's
the
kind of like a supernatural element to this game.
Yeah, no, it's a slight divine intervention on the back end that we added. So
Well, and I didn't understand the relationship between the speed and the number of events, so difficult events that you ran into. So I was looking at it from the perspective, of having played Oregon Trail for basically 30 years and thinking
yeah,
like, oh yeah, of course I need horses and camels. How am I going to get across the desert without these things? I got to
yeah,
load up on as many of these as possible. And then it mentions like, oh, you're going really fast. So I'm like, fantastic, right? Pedal to the
great,
metal.
great
Let's go.
time. Yeah,
And then it's
exactly.
like
Yeah,
I get to the desert and it's like, man, I'm going through a lot of Bedouin raids, and this is tough. And so now it makes sense.
yeah, yeah. No, there are definitely things where you could obviously the basis of the mechanics for the game are thought through the Oregon Trail, but yeah, we add lots of different variables and different dynamics that the Oregon Trail and even the new one don't have, and how they're sort of trying to recreate travel in the past in a
Mm-hmm.
sense. So we also have the character bonuses as well, which we added in
Yeah.
later on. So there's like 45 different side characters that I created that can be your 3 traveling party members, and they give you different bonuses. And this was our most recent add to the game, where I had students playing through it, and they would just let their family members or caregiver members die
Of
because they're like,
course.
well, it's not me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Of
So,
course.
so,
Of course. Yeah.
so, so what we did, and even at that point, you got like extra points at the end for having everyone survive, which is like the original Oregon Trail, but
Yeah.
it they didn't care. Students didn't care. So we're like, okay, we need to breathe value into these characters. So we made all the characters, all 45 of them, to put at coffee houses, which is the cultural center of the Ottoman world at this time, with coffee house culture being on the rise in the Ottoman world, where coffee houses come from. That's where you recruit them, and they can help you fend off bandits. They can give you extra water per day. They
Mm-hmm.
can, sometimes they can turn on you and rob you if they're not trustworthy.
Yeah.
Sometimes you have to pay them to keep them going to travel with you. And so that was a whole system we put in place to, one, add more variability, add you more control, give you something that can give you more control to help protect you from the negative events that occur to you, but also to help you care about the people you travel with, so you don't
Let
just
me
let
tell
them
you
all
something.
die.
Let me
Yeah.
tell you something. Gen Z does not care about NPCs. I
Yes,
mean,
that was
it's
it.
just
Yeah.
straight up. Like it's just a fact.
Yes. No, they're letting them all die. Yeah.
So speaking of students, how do you use this game with them? Well, what type of assignments, what type of in-class lesson plans do you use this game for?
Yeah. So I usually have them write a sort of a diary with it, where they write it in the voice of their character day by day of what they encounter along the way. I tell them they have to try to incorporate some of the historical quotes because I spent so long digging them up. But, and some of them will do it very interestingly, where they'll like reference. There's a great one of my favorite quotes I added from it is it's one of the starter quotes at the start of the game before you set off. There's a long quote from a 18th century pilgrim from Morocco, Ibn Tayyib, and he gives a list of the 10 things you need to know to be in a good care for a good caravan leader. And he gives warnings about, worry about bandits, be concerned about theft and all this stuff along the way, know where all the wells are for water. And so some of the students, very creatively would utilize that text as like in their diary, which I, very much enjoyed. I didn't tell them to do this, and they would write in their diary, oh, and my character consulted this text, which then told them to do this, and then this happened to me. And I find it a very engaging way for them to engage with the game, rather than, once again, trying to have that active playthrough rather than just a passive playthrough.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, it's going to happen no matter what. But by having them do like a journal throughout of their character that they submit at the end with like a screenshot of their final route that they take, even if they died along the way, or retired early along the way, that still provides sort of them a intro into the things that shaped sort of the Ottoman world, the 17th century world. The way in which the Hajj Trail is structured is that when you get to Mecca and Medina, there's no gamifying the religious aspects or the rites of the pilgrimage in
Mm-hmm.
Mecca. It's really just tells you what they are once you get there. It's really about the journey. And the journey introduces you to the cultural history of the Ottoman world. So the Hajj is really the destination, um, as a way to tell you the social history and cultural history of this region. And the Hajj is sort of like, is once again this sort of foil for telling that story.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and I think is your point you're making here, using the kind of journals, that's something that was a part of the original Oregon Trail that MEC developed in
Mm-hmm.
the mid 70s. The very first version of the game was just kind of a one off lesson plan, thinking about using
Yeah.
an entire game as just a one-off lesson plan for a student teacher. But when they, kind of returned to the game in the mid 70s, and Don Rawitz went back to it, it was kind of this idea of incorporating it into, lectures on westward expansion, and using it in a style of, kind of student journals and grading student journals. And so it's got a long tradition. I think it's really useful pedagogy. To be honest, that's what I do with the Oregon Trail in my classes. Kind of
Mm-hmm.
analyzing it in terms of the narratives that come out of the game, but then also analyzing it in terms of, how do we know that there's some elements of this game that you could improve the history on. What have we read in the primary
Yeah.
sources? And
Yeah.
so there's a lot of great reasons to use games, and I think not just using it in terms of gameplay and mechanics, but also using it as the basis for critique can be just as instructive. Like having a bad game could be
Yeah.
just as instructive as using a good one. And with that said, I think the Hajj Trail is a good game. So
That's right. No, yeah, I know. I have that same sort of. I teach. I've been teaching last year and this year, this coming spring, a gaming and history class at my university, Central Connecticut State, and it's yeah, it's trying to get students to understand that some of them, like particularly like looking at the original Oregon Trail, be like it's okay if you don't like the game.
yeah,
That critique of what it's missing is important,
yeah,
and sort of learning to look at games and understand that you can still learn something from it, even if even in what's missing. Sometimes it's easier to sort of think about the past if you're critiquing something because there's some glaring
yeah.
omissions in it as well. So
100%, 100%. So what are your future plans with this game?
yeah, so right now we've sort of been in a holding period. There's a brief moment this summer where and last spring where put together a pitch deck because we want to make eventually. It's called Haj Trail 2.0, the funded version, as this was all volunteer. This is all my own time, this original one. And we made a pitch deck. I talked to indie developers, basically what it would take to get an indie company to make this game, but sort of similar in style to Pentiment. So,
Mm-hmm.
and ironically, we had thought about this before Pentiment came out, and I was like, "Oh, this is great. This is exactly what we want to do, but with Ottoman miniature painting."
Yeah.
So, have the art style be a uniform style of Ottoman painting. If there's eventual expansions to Mughal, Safavid, we would then have the painting style shift as you change in the world to
Nice.
where you're
Yeah.
going.
Yeah.
And basically have it still be, you go to the town, you go between places, you have your characters. But we had this whole pitch deck, talked to folks, got a whole idea of what it would cost, like 200K. We'd need to like fundraise for it, and then just no funders because in the broader academic world or Islamic studies, people see a game and they're like, well, that's not as important as this other project. So that was sort of a
Yeah.
failed attempt to
Yeah.
get funding for that. So as with anything, you have to go, well, I guess I have to do it myself. So I've been learning Unity and then I've talked very closely with Murat Palta, who's a pop art designer in Turkey who does like Star Wars, but in Ottoman painting style. So he does all this sort of digital fun artwork. And so basically the goal is that I'll learn Unity to do this, the basic background for how we're just going to transform the Hajj Trail into a different format,
Mm-hmm.
use the general same story and most of the same dynamics and different things as well, and then have the arts basically fundraise or Kickstarter eventually just funding for Marat get him to pay him to do the artwork,
artwork. Yeah.
the digital art, which is always the most expensive
That's the
things in most
biggest
things.
expense. Yeah. Yeah.
So that's the plan going forward. We'll see. Hopefully this coming summer we'll roll out what those stages would be as I learn Unity. But that's the plan. It's going to be, it would be called Seyahat, which is the term for travel in Ottoman Turkish, and the name of Evliya Çelebi's travel log. So we'd call it Seyahat,
That's great.
and we had hoped to add eventually. Once again, we just want to create the single player version at this point, but eventually we'd want to have like a multiplayer version that you could have students in a group in class all play in the same caravan and make choices and vote on choices together along each stage. They choose a caravan leader, and then they make choices and things along the way, and then have the events in between be quick time events, to give a little bit more agency or
Nice.
feeling of agency in
Yeah.
those moments. So
Yeah, that's a good idea. I love the sound of the plan. If I had, $300,000 to share,
there you go. Yeah.
I would definitely consider it. And I really admire, the work that you're doing, kind of taking up these game development tools to try to use them for, research, but then also for pedagogy. And I think, I wish more historians thought in those ways. I think when we're trained, at the undergraduate level, the graduate level, we think of terms of, word processor software, and we don't really think outside of that. We don't think of other technological tools that we can use to share our work. And yet when it comes to the history of digital games, Oregon Trail, created by a history undergrad student teacher, and not only changed kind of games and pedagogy, but changed digital games, right? It's one of the first digital games ever made. So in a lot of ways, the work that you're doing is kind of returning us back to a point where historians, history educators were really involved in development. So I hope somebody changes their mind and gives you a bunch of money.
Yeah, or I'm just very very good at learning Unity quickly, and
Yeah,
so
there you go.
and thankfully my possible collaborator Murat, when I was talking to him, he's just a digital artist that's like Ottoman pop art and stuff, but he was saying how he just loves Pentiment, and so there's some in for it too. So hopefully it wouldn't be too much of a cost in the Kickstarter to get just the basic version demo out. But yeah, it is one of these things where you make something and you see in academia, especially, lots of these big projects funded and they get all this starting grant money, and it's like, and what they're doing is not very impressive. but you're like, but they got the funding because it's like the traditional thing you do. And if you do something that's not within a certain box, funding bodies just don't see it in the same way as useful, even though the Hajj Trail will be far more impactful in shaping the imagination of how people think about, how students think about the Ottoman past and the Hajj in the Ottoman world, more so than my book will ever do. When my book comes out, with Stanford University Press in a few years, that's sure a few people will read it, but the Hajj Trail is going to be far more impactful and sort of just shaping how people see the past, and that's what historians do. And that's what it's just unfortunate that the field is still very centered on sort of traditional modes of research and education.
Well, on that somewhat dour note, that does it for this episode of History Respawn. Tyler, thank you so much for joining us today.
No, thanks for having me, and I apologize to anyone that dies on the Hajj Trail. I try to warn you in the text. That's all I say.
Well, there you go, listener. Thank you, listener, for joining us today. If you enjoy History Respawn, please check out our website for our back catalog, historyrespawn.com. And if you really enjoy our work, please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/History Respawn. And until next time, goodbye.